They say a marriage built on duty feels nothing at all, but no one warns you what happens when it begins to feel everything. The bells of St. Bartholomew's tolled low and solemn, echoing through the nearly empty chapel as Clara Bennett stood at the altar, her gloved hands clasped so tightly the lace pressed faint crescents into her skin, and though the air carried the faint scent of candle wax and winter roses, she felt none of it, because this was not the wedding she had once imagined, not a union of warmth or whispered promises, but a transaction measured in debts and survival. And beside her stood Duke Alexander. Whitmore, tall, composed, untouchable, his dark coat cut to perfection, his expression carved from something colder than stone, and when the minister spoke the vows, his voice remained steady, unshaken, as if each word weighed nothing at all, as if the woman beside him did not exist beyond the role she was meant to fill. And when he finally slid the ring onto her finger, his touch was brief, impersonal, a gesture completed rather than felt, and Clara understood in that moment with a clarity that settled deep in her chest that she had not been chosen, not truly, only required, only placed where circumstance demanded her to stand. And yet she did not falter, because there were letters folded carefully in her pocket reminding her what waited if she did, her father's debts inked in unforgiving lines, the threat of losing the only home she had ever known. And so she lifted her chin, her voice quiet but unwavering as she repeated her vows, offering dignity where there was no tenderness, offering strength where there was no illusion. And when it was done, when the final words faded into the vaulted ceiling, Alexander stepped back first, not looking at her, not once, as though distance was something he had already decided to keep. And outside the chapel, the cold struck sharper than before, a wind that carried the scent of approaching snow. And as the carriage door closed behind them, sealing them into a silence that stretched heavy and unbroken, he finally spoke, his voice low, measured, each word deliberate. "You will have everything required of your position," he said, eyes fixed ahead rather than on her. "But you must understand, this marriage exists for obligation alone." And Clara felt the words settle between them like frost, quiet and final, but she did not respond immediately, instead watching the blur of winter trees beyond the glass, her reflection faintly visible, a duchess now in name, a stranger still in truth. And when she finally answered, her voice was softer than the storm gathering outside, yet no less certain. "Then I will fulfill my role, Your Grace," she said, and nothing more, because there was nothing more to give. And as Whitmore Hall rose in the distance, its dark silhouette cutting into the pale sky like a memory long abandoned, neither of them could have known that what waited within those walls was not simply a marriage bound by duty, but something far more dangerous, something neither had intended to feel, and something neither would be able to ignore. The carriage wheels crunched over the gravel drive as Whitmore Hall loomed closer, its towering stone walls rising like something untouched by warmth or time. And Clara felt the weight of it before she ever stepped inside, the kind of silence that did not welcome but endured. And when the doors opened, the servants lined the entrance with perfect stillness, their faces composed yet watchful, as if measuring her worth in a single glance. And Alexander did not pause, did not offer his arm, only walked forward with the quiet authority of a man who belonged entirely to this place, leaving her to follow half a step behind, already understanding the invisible distance he intended to keep. And inside, the air was warmer but no less cold, filled with the faint scent of polished wood and extinguished fires, chandeliers casting long shadows that stretched across marble floors. And Clara removed her gloves slowly, steadying herself as she took in the vast hall, portraits lining the walls with eyes that seemed to linger too long, histories she did not yet understand. And when the housekeeper approached with a respectful bow, her voice was polite but measured, welcoming Clara as the new Duchess of Whitmore, the title spoken with precision, not affection. And Alexander's voice followed shortly after, calm, controlled, as he issued instructions regarding her chambers, the household, the expectations, each word efficient, leaving no space for misunderstanding. And Clara listened without interruption, nodding when required, her posture straight, her expression composed, though something inside her shifted quietly, not pain exactly, but the awareness that she had entered a life where warmth would not be offered freely, and as she was led through endless corridors, her footsteps softened by thick rugs, she noticed the details others might miss. A vase of flowers long since dried, a piano closed and untouched, a draft slipping through tall windows as though even the walls could not fully keep the cold outside. And when she reached her room, it was grand, immaculate, yet impersonal, a space prepared but not lived in. And after the door closed behind her, the silence returned heavier than before, pressing in around her until even her breath felt too loud. And for a moment she stood still, staring at the unfamiliar reflection in the mirror, a duchess by name, a stranger in every other way, and far below, in a study lit by a single lamp, Alexander remained alone, his hand resting against the back of a chair as he stared at nothing in particular, though the image of Clara standing at the altar flickered uninvited in his mind. The steadiness in her voice, the absence of pleading, something that had not aligned with what he had expected, and he dismissed it almost immediately, forcing his thoughts back to ledgers and obligations, to the reasons this marriage existed at all. And yet as the wind outside began to rise, rattling faintly against the tall windows of Whitmore Hall, there lingered a quiet awareness he could not quite silence, that something within those walls had already begun to shift, however subtly, however dangerously. And above, Clara moved to the window, her fingers brushing the cold glass as the first snow began to fall, soft and relentless, covering the grounds in silence. And though she had promised herself she would expect nothing, demand nothing, she could not ignore the strange, unsettled feeling that this place, this man, and this life bound by duty alone would not remain as unchanged as they both believed. Morning arrived without warmth, the pale winter light filtering through tall windows that did little to soften the rigid stillness of Whitmore Hall. And Clara woke not to comfort, but to the quiet realization that this place would not adjust to her presence. She would have to adjust to it. And when she entered the breakfast room precisely at 8 o'clock as instructed, she found the long table already set with careful perfection, silver gleaming, tea steaming gently, yet only one place occupied. And Alexander sat at the far end, his posture straight, his attention fixed on a folded document as though the world beyond it did not exist. And he did not rise when she entered, did not offer greeting beyond the briefest glance that acknowledged her presence and nothing more. And Clara took her seat with equal composure, her movements quiet, measured, refusing to let the silence diminish her, and for several moments, only the faint clink of porcelain and the distant whisper of wind against the windows filled the space between them, until she finally spoke, her voice calm, respectful, yet steady, asking about the estate, about her responsibilities, because if she was to remain here, she would not do so as a shadow. And Alexander paused then, just slightly, as though the question itself had not been expected, and when he answered, his tone remained controlled, outlining duties, appearances, expectations, each word precise. But there was something else beneath it, something almost reluctant, as though he had not anticipated engagement, had not prepared for presence. And Clara listened carefully, committing each detail to memory, not out of obligation alone, but because it was the only way she knew how to exist with dignity in a place that offered none freely. And when the meal concluded, he stood without ceremony, offering a single nod before leaving her alone once more. But this time, the silence did not feel quite as heavy, because it had been broken, even if only briefly. And throughout the day, Clara moved through Whitmore Hall with quiet intention, speaking with staff, observing routines, noting the subtle fractures beneath the polished surface, the fatigue in a maid's eyes, the hesitation in a steward's voice, the way certain rooms remained closed as though forgotten on purpose. And she did not intrude, did not demand, but where she could, she adjusted small things, a fire lit earlier, a meal prepared with more care, a kind word offered where none had been expected. And these were small changes, nearly invisible, yet they shifted something in the air, something no one spoke of but everyone noticed. And by evening, when Alexander returned to the main hall, removing his gloves with the same composed precision he carried in all things, he paused almost imperceptibly, his gaze moving across the space as though sensing a difference he could not immediately name. The warmth of a fire that should not yet have been lit, the quiet order where there had once been absence. And he said nothing, because saying something would mean acknowledging it, would mean acknowledging her. And yet later, as he stood alone in his study, the steady scratch of his pen faltering for just a second longer than usual, he found his thoughts drifting back to the breakfast table, to the way she had spoken without hesitation, without pleading, without fear, and it unsettled him in a way he did not welcome, because nothing about this arrangement was meant to change. Nothing about it was meant to grow. And still, somewhere within the silent halls of Whitmore, something had already begun. By the fourth day, Whitmore Hall no longer resisted Clara's presence as sharply, yet it did not welcome her either. It simply observed, as though waiting to see whether she would fade like the others before her or remain long enough to matter. And Clara had already decided she would remain, not out of hope, but because leaving was not a luxury she could afford. And so she continued her quiet work, moving through the corridors with steady purpose, learning the rhythm of the estate, the unspoken rules that governed it, the way the servants avoided certain wings, the way conversations softened when she entered, not from disrespect, but from uncertainty, because no one yet knew what kind of Duchess she would become, and Clara did not attempt to declare it. She let it reveal itself in small ways, in the way she listened rather than commanded, in the way she noticed details others had long stopped seeing, like the locked conservatory at the far end of the west wing, its glass panes clouded with dust, its doors untouched for years, and when she asked about it, the answer came hesitant, careful, as though the room held something more than neglect, something tied to the past the household did not speak of openly, and Clara did not press. But later that afternoon, she found herself standing before those very doors, her fingers brushing lightly against the cold handle before she turned it, slowly, as if the space beyond might resist her entry. And when the door opened, the scent of earth and faded blossoms greeted her, the air still, heavy with absence, and inside, the once grand conservatory had been left to decay in quiet dignity, vines curled in lifeless shapes, glass catching pale light that did not quite reach the ground. And Clara stepped inside, her footsteps soft against the stone floor, her gaze moving over the remnants of what had once been tended with care, and she did not need to be told that this place had mattered, that it had been abandoned not from neglect, but from loss, and something in her chest tightened, not from sorrow she understood, but from the recognition of it, the kind of silence that followed something once cherished. And without fully deciding to, she moved forward, kneeling beside a planter where the soil had hardened, her gloved hands brushing lightly against it as though testing whether anything could still grow. And she stayed there longer than she intended, the quiet wrapping around her not as emptiness, but as something waiting, something paused rather than finished. And when she finally rose, there was a faint trace of dirt on her gloves, a small mark of presence in a place that had known none for years, and she left without announcing what she had done, without asking permission, because some things did not require it. And later that evening, as Alexander walked the halls on his usual path toward his study, he paused once more, his steps slowing as his gaze drifted toward the west wing, toward the door that had remained closed for longer than he cared to measure. And though he told himself it was nothing, just a shift in routine, just the house settling differently, he found himself standing before it without fully realizing how he had arrived, his hand resting against the handle that had not been touched in years. And for a moment, he did not move, because opening that door meant acknowledging something he had deliberately left behind, something he had sealed away with quiet finality. And yet when he finally pushed it open, the faintest difference met him, subtle, almost imperceptible, the air disturbed, the stillness altered, and his gaze moved across the room slowly, taking in the unchanged decay and yet sensing something beneath it, something that had been disturbed not with force, but with care. And he said nothing, because there was no one to hear it. But for the first time since Clara had entered Whitmore Hall, Alexander Whitmore felt something he had not expected to feel again. Not grief, not yet, but the faint, unsettling awareness that the past he had buried might not remain untouched forever. Alexander did not mention the conservatory the next morning, not when Clara entered the breakfast room with the same quiet composure, not when she asked about the estate accounts, not even when their eyes briefly met across the long table. because to speak of it would mean acknowledging that something had changed, and he was not yet willing to give that change a name, and Clara, for her part, did not bring it up either, though there was a faint trace of soil still beneath her nails, a small reminder of the space she had stepped into without permission and without regret, and the silence between them remained. But it was no longer empty. It carried something unspoken, something waiting, and as the days unfolded, Clara returned to the conservatory in the quiet hours, not as an act of defiance, but as something closer to instinct, and each time she entered, she moved with care, clearing away dead branches, opening shutters to let in what little winter light could reach, brushing dust from glass that had long forgotten the touch of hands, and she did not attempt to restore it fully, not yet. She only made space, as if allowing the room to breathe again, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the air shifted, less stagnant, less resigned, and outside, the snow continued to fall in steady silence, covering the grounds in white that erased footprints as quickly as they were made. And one afternoon, as Clara knelt beside a neglected planter, her fingers pressing gently into soil that had begun to soften, she did not hear the door open behind her, did not notice the presence that filled the space until she felt it, that subtle change in the air that came not from wind, but from someone standing too still, and when she turned, she found Alexander there, his figure framed by pale light, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed not on her, but on the room itself, as though he were seeing it for the first time in years, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them. But this time it was not cold, it was tense, alive with something neither of them had prepared for, and Clara rose slowly, brushing her hands against her skirt, her posture composed, though her heartbeat had shifted into something quicker, uncertain, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of its usual distance. "This room was not meant to be opened," he said, not as a command, but as a statement of fact, and Clara met his gaze steadily, not challenging, not apologizing, simply present. "It was not meant to be left like this either," she replied, her voice soft, but certain, and something in his expression tightened then, not anger, not quite, but something closer to conflict, because she was not wrong, and yet she had stepped into a part of his life he had deliberately sealed away, and for a brief moment, the weight of that past pressed against him, heavy and familiar, but it did not settle the way it once had. It did not silence the room completely, because now there was movement here, now there was her, and he exhaled slowly, as though releasing something he had held for too long, though he did not yet understand what it was. And when he looked at her again, truly looked this time, he saw not intrusion, but intention, not defiance, but quiet persistence, and it unsettled him more than anger ever could, because anger would have been easier to dismiss, easier to control, and instead, he found himself saying nothing further, turning slightly as though to leave, but pausing at the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame before he spoke again, his voice low, almost reluctant. "Do not overexert yourself." And the words were simple, practical, but they carried something unfamiliar beneath them, something that did not belong to duty alone, and Clara watched him go without responding. Yet as the door closed behind him, the silence he left was no longer the same as before, because now, within the quiet walls of Whitmore Hall, there was something neither of them could deny any longer, something small, fragile, and dangerous, beginning to take root. The next morning, the snow had stopped, but the world beyond Whitmore Hall remained buried beneath a quiet, unbroken white, as though time itself had slowed, and inside, that same stillness lingered in the corridors, yet it no longer felt untouched, because something had shifted, something neither Clara nor Alexander could fully name, and at breakfast, the silence returned as expected, but it carried a different weight, not absence, but awareness, and when Clara took her seat, she did not lower her gaze as she had before, nor did she search for permission in his expression. She simply existed within the space, steady, unyielding in her quiet way, and Alexander noticed it immediately, though he gave no outward sign, his attention fixed once more on the papers before him. Yet his focus did not settle as easily as it once had, because the image of her in the conservatory lingered in his mind. The way she had stood there without apology, without hesitation, as though she belonged even in a place he had deemed forbidden, and it unsettled him in a way that logic could not dismiss. And when she spoke again, asking about the staff quarters, about the provisions for winter, her voice remained composed, but there was a subtle difference now, a confidence that had not been present before, not bold, not intrusive, but certain, as though she had already decided her place here would not be defined by his distance alone. And he answered as he always did, with precision, with control, yet there was a fraction more detail than necessary, a fraction more attention than he had intended to give. And when the meal ended, he did not leave immediately, a hesitation so slight it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Clara felt it, that pause, that unspoken moment where something might have been said, and yet it was not. And he turned away soon after, the distance restored, though not entirely as it had been. And throughout the day, Clara continued her quiet work, her presence now woven more firmly into the rhythm of the house, and the servants, though still reserved, no longer watched her with uncertainty alone. There was something else there now, something closer to trust. Because she had not imposed, she had not demanded, she had simply remained. And in the afternoon, she returned once more to the conservatory, the light filtering through the glass a little clearer now, the air less stagnant, and she moved through the space with familiar ease, adjusting what little she could, not seeking to restore it completely, but to keep it from fading further into neglect. And as she worked, she found a small, forgotten pot near the window, its soil dry but not entirely lifeless, and she paused, her fingers resting lightly against it, considering for a moment before she carefully added water, just enough, not too much, as though testing whether something fragile might still respond. And she did not expect anything in return, not yet, but the act itself felt meaningful, a quiet defiance against the idea that all things left behind must remain so. And later, as evening settled once more over Whitmore Hall, Alexander found himself drawn again toward the west wing, not out of habit, but something less defined, something that did not align with reason. And when he reached the conservatory, he did not enter immediately, instead standing just beyond the doorway, watching. Without announcing himself as Clara moved within the fading light, her figure softened by the glass and shadow, and there was something in the way she worked, something unguarded, something sincere, that held his attention longer than he intended. And for a moment, the past did not press against him as it once had. It did not demand his silence or his distance, because it was being met with something else now, something quieter, something that did not attempt to replace it, but to exist alongside it. And that realization unsettled him more than anything before, because it meant that what had been fixed, what had been unchanging, might no longer remain so. And as Clara finally paused, her gaze lifting briefly toward the window, she sensed it again, that presence, that shift in the air, and though she did not turn immediately, she knew he was there, standing just beyond the threshold, watching, not as a duke observing his Duchess, but as a man confronting something he had not prepared himself to feel. And when she finally faced him, there were no words exchanged, none needed, because in that quiet moment, in that shared stillness, something had already been acknowledged, something that neither duty nor distance could fully conceal any longer. The following morning carried a different kind of tension, one that settled beneath the surface of Whitmore Hall like a quiet current, unseen yet impossible to ignore, and Clara felt it the moment she stepped into the corridor, the subtle shift in the way the servants greeted her, the faint pause before they spoke, as though something unspoken had begun to circulate through the house, and she did not need to ask what it was, because wordless changes always traveled faster than spoken ones, and, by midday, she understood fully, not through whispers, but through the arrival of a carriage at the front drive, its polished exterior cutting sharply against the pale snow, and from it stepped Lady Evelyn Harcourt, her presence as deliberate as it was unwelcome, her posture flawless, her gaze sharp with the kind of quiet judgment that did not require words to wound. And Clara met her in the main hall with the same composure she had carried since the beginning, her hands folded lightly, her expression calm, though she recognized immediately the kind of scrutiny that stood before her. And Lady Evelyn did not waste time on pleasantries, her voice smooth, precise, carrying just enough sweetness to conceal the edge beneath it, as she remarked upon the unexpected nature of the marriage, the speed of it, the circumstances that had made it necessary. Each word carefully chosen to remind Clara of her place, not as a duchess by right, but by arrangement. And Clara listened without interruption, her gaze steady, refusing to shrink beneath the weight of implication. And when she responded, her voice was soft, measured, yet unwavering, offering no defense, no explanation, only quiet acknowledgement that left no room for further attack, and that, more than any protest could have, unsettled Lady Evelyn, whose smile tightened ever so slightly, because there was no weakness to exploit, no desperation to expose, and still, the tension lingered, thickening the air as the conversation stretched longer than it should have, until the sound of footsteps echoed across the marble floor, firm, unmistakable, and both women turned as Alexander entered the hall, his presence immediate, his expression composed yet sharper than before, his gaze moving from Clara to Lady Evelyn with a precision that missed nothing, and for a brief moment, silence held the space, not empty, but charged, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet authority that did not need to rise to command attention. "Lady Evelyn," he said, his tone even, controlled, yet edged with something colder beneath. "You arrived without notice." And though the words were neutral, the meaning was not, and Lady Evelyn inclined her head slightly, her composure flawless, offering some polite justification, though her eyes flickered briefly toward Clara, as if to remind him of the topic she had chosen to address in his absence, and Alexander's gaze followed that glance, settling on Clara for a fraction longer than usual, and in that moment, something shifted again, something unspoken yet unmistakable, because he saw it, the quiet strength in her posture, the absence of distress, the way she had held her ground without drawing attention to it. And when he looked back at Lady Evelyn, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only a clarity that had not existed before. "My wife," he said, the words simple, deliberate, yet carrying a weight that altered the entire room, "requires no defense nor explanation, and she will not be subjected to insinuations within my home." And the silence that followed was absolute, not fragile, but final, because there was no mistaking the line that had just been drawn, and for the first time since Clara had arrived at Whitmore Hall, the distance Alexander had so carefully maintained fractured in a way that could not be undone, and Clara felt it, not as warmth, not yet, but as something steadier, something that settled quietly beneath the surface. And as Lady Evelyn's composure held, though only just, Clara understood that this moment, this small, precise shift, had changed more than either of them had intended, because it was no longer only duty that stood between her and the man beside her. It was something else, something that had begun without permission, and something neither of them could fully deny. After Lady Evelyn's departure, the silence she left behind did not dissipate. It settled deeper into the walls of Whitmore Hall, lingering in the corridors and in the spaces between words that were not spoken, and Clara felt it as she stood alone in the drawing room, her hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, her breath steady though something within her had shifted in a way she could not easily define. Because Alexander's words had not been loud, had not been dramatic, and yet they had drawn a line that could not be undone, and for the first time since their marriage, she had not felt entirely alone within his world, and that realization unsettled her more than Lady Evelyn's sharpest remarks ever could, because it introduced something she had not allowed herself to consider, something far more dangerous than indifference. And when Alexander entered the room moments later, the air changed again, not tense as before, but uncertain, as though both of them were aware that something had passed between them that neither had intended, and he paused just inside the doorway, his gaze finding her without hesitation, yet he did not immediately speak, as though the words he might have chosen no longer fit as easily as they once had. And Clara turned to face him fully, her posture composed, her expression calm, though her eyes held a quiet question she did not voice. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching. But this time it was not empty, it was filled with the weight of what had just occurred. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its usual detachment. "You were not required to endure that," he said, the words simple, yet carrying more meaning than he had intended to reveal, and Clara's gaze did not waver, her response coming after a brief pause, measured, thoughtful. "I have endured far worse for far less," she said quietly, not as a challenge, but as truth, and something in his expression shifted at that, something sharper, something that hinted at understanding he had not sought, and he stepped further into the room then, closing the distance between them by a fraction, though it felt like more, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried a tension that had not been there before. "That will not be necessary here." And the certainty in his tone was unmistakable, not a command, not an obligation, but something closer to a promise he had not fully realized he was making. And Clara felt it, that difference, that subtle change in the space between them, and it unsettled her in equal measure, because promises implied expectation, and expectation was something she had long learned to avoid. And so she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without accepting them fully, because she could not yet, and the silence returned once more, but it did not close the distance as it once had, it lingered instead, as though both of them stood on the edge of something neither was ready to name. And when Alexander finally turned away, his hand brushing briefly against the back of a chair as he moved toward the door, he paused once more, not looking back this time, but his voice reached her all the same, quieter now, almost reluctant. "The conservatory," he said, as though the word itself required more effort than it should. "If you intend to continue, ensure the gardeners assist you." And the statement was practical, expected, and yet beneath it lay something else, something unspoken but clear, permission, not given lightly, not given freely, but given nonetheless, and Clara watched him leave without responding. Yet as the door closed behind him, she understood that the line he had drawn earlier had not only been for her protection, it had been for something else as well, something that was beginning to take shape within him, something he did not yet trust, and something she was not certain she should. The next evening arrived with a quiet stillness that seemed almost deliberate, as though Whitmore Hall itself had chosen to hold its breath, and Clara felt it as she stood within the conservatory, the fading light casting long, muted shadows across the glass and stone, and though the space was not yet restored, it no longer felt abandoned, the air softer now, touched by small acts of care that had begun to reshape it. And she moved slowly among the planters, her hands steady, her thoughts quieter than they had been in days, because for the first time since her arrival, she was no longer simply enduring her place here, she was shaping it, even if only in ways that could not yet be seen by all. And when the door opened behind her, she did not startle, did not turn immediately, because she had already come to recognize the subtle shift that preceded him, the way the silence altered, the way the space seemed to narrow without sound. And when she finally looked back, Alexander stood there once more, his presence no longer unexpected, though no less significant. And this time he did not remain at the threshold, did not observe from a distance. He stepped inside, the quiet echo of his footsteps marking a line he had not crossed before. And for a moment, he said nothing, his gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in the changes that had begun to take root. The faint return of life where there had once been only stillness, and something in his expression softened, though only slightly, as though he did not fully trust what he was seeing, and Clara watched him carefully, not intruding upon the moment, not claiming it, because she understood instinctively that this space belonged to something beyond her, something he had yet to confront fully. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried less distance than before, though the restraint remained. "It has not looked like this in years," he said quietly, the words more to the room than to her, and Clara inclined her head slightly, her response measured, respectful. "It was not meant to be forgotten," she replied, and the simplicity of it settled between them, not as challenge, but as truth. And Alexander's gaze shifted then, meeting hers fully, and for a brief moment, something unguarded flickered there, something that did not align with the man who had stood so firmly behind duty and distance, and it lingered just long enough to be felt before it was drawn back once more, replaced by the composure he wore so easily. And yet the distance between them had already changed, no longer fixed, no longer certain. And as the silence returned, it did not separate them as it once had. It held them in the same space, suspended between what had been and what was beginning to emerge. And when Clara turned slightly, reaching for the small planter she had tended the day before, she paused, her breath catching for the briefest moment, because there, barely visible against the darkened soil, a single fragile sprout had begun to push its way toward the light, and it was small, almost insignificant, yet undeniable, and she did not speak of it, did not call attention to it. But something in her expression shifted, something quieter, something deeper, and Alexander noticed it, his gaze following hers, settling on the planter, and though he said nothing, though he did not move closer, there was a change in him that could not be dismissed, because in that small, fragile sign of life, something within the walls of Whitmore Hall had answered, something long dormant had stirred, and for the first time since Clara had entered his world, Alexander Whitmore felt the unsettling, undeniable pull-off. Something he could no longer control, not obligation, not duty, but something far more dangerous, something that had begun to grow without permission, and something neither of them could turn away from now. That night, the wind returned with a quiet persistence, brushing softly against the tall windows of Whitmore Hall as though the world beyond sought entry into the stillness within, and Clara lay awake longer than she intended, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of shadows shifting across her ceiling, her thoughts unsettled not by fear, but by something far less familiar, something she had not prepared herself to confront, because what had begun in the conservatory was no longer something she could dismiss as mere duty or distraction. It had taken form, fragile yet undeniable, and she did not yet know what it demanded of her, only that it could not be ignored. And elsewhere within the estate, Alexander stood alone in his study, the fire casting low light across the room. Though he had long since stopped reading the documents before him, his thoughts drawn instead to a single, quiet image, the faint green sprout pushing through darkened soil, and more than that, to the expression he had seen in Clara's eyes, not triumph, not expectation, but something steady, something patient, and it unsettled him more than any demand could have, because it asked nothing of him, and yet seemed to alter everything. And he moved then, abruptly, as though remaining still would force him to confront what he was not ready to name, crossing the room with measured steps before stopping before a portrait that hung beside the fireplace, its presence familiar, unchanging, and for a moment, his gaze lingered there, drawn by memory rather than intention. But the weight he had once carried so easily now felt different, not diminished, but no longer absolute, as though something else had begun to share its space. And that realization tightened something within him, not in resistance, but in uncertainty, and he turned away soon after, extinguishing the lamp before leaving the room entirely, as though distance might restore what had once been clear, and the following day brought with it a quiet brightness, the storm having passed, leaving the grounds untouched and still beneath a pale winter sun. And Clara rose early, her steps instinctively guiding her once more toward the conservatory, where the air felt softer now, less burdened by silence. And when she entered, she paused briefly, her gaze moving immediately toward the planter, and there it was, unchanged yet more certain, the small sprout reaching faintly upward, its presence delicate, yet persistent, and something within her steadied at the sight, not hope exactly, but something close enough to resemble it, and she moved closer, kneeling beside it, her fingers brushing lightly against the rim of the pot, careful not to disturb what had begun to grow. And she did not hear him enter this time, because his steps were quieter than before, more deliberate, as though he no longer wished to announce his presence. And when she finally sensed him, it was not through sound, but through the subtle shift in the air that had become familiar. And when she looked up, their gazes met without hesitation, without distance, and for a moment, neither spoke, because words would have lessened something that did not require them. And Alexander's gaze moved once more to the planter, to the small, fragile sign of life that had not existed days before. And when he spoke, his voice was lower than it had ever been, stripped of certainty. It should not have survived the cold, he said quietly, and Clara's response came just as softly, though with a steadiness he could not ignore. Some things are stronger than they appear. And the silence that followed did not separate them, it held them, because in that moment, the truth neither of them had spoken began to take shape, not fully realized, not yet understood, but present all the same, something that had begun without permission, something that had grown quietly, and something neither of them could return to ignoring, no matter how much they might try. The days that followed did not return to what they had been, though nothing outwardly declared the change, because Whitmore Hall remained as it always had, its halls quiet, its routines precise, and yet beneath that stillness, something had shifted in ways that could not be undone, and Clara felt it in the smallest moments. In the way the servants no longer hesitated when she gave direction, in the way the house itself seemed to respond more readily to her presence, and most of all, in the way Alexander no longer avoided the spaces she occupied, as though distance had ceased to be his first instinct, and though he spoke no more than before, though his words remained measured and deliberate, there was a difference in how they settled between them, less final, less absolute. And one evening, as the light faded early and the cold pressed softly against the windows, Clara found herself once again in the conservatory, her steps slower now, more thoughtful, because the space no longer felt like something she was restoring. It felt like something she was sharing, and she moved carefully among the planters, her gaze lingering on the small sprout that had begun to strengthen, its presence no longer fragile alone, but determined, and she reached toward it, her fingers hovering just above the soil, as though acknowledging it without disturbing its growth. And behind her, the door opened with quiet familiarity, not abrupt, not hesitant, but expected, and when she turned, Alexander stood there once more, though this time, there was no pause at the threshold, no distance held deliberately. He entered fully, closing the door behind him as though sealing the space from the rest of the world. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with everything neither of them had spoken, and when he approached, his steps slow, deliberate, Clara did not step back, did not retreat, though her breath shifted slightly, betraying the awareness she could no longer deny. And he stopped only a few feet from her, closer than he had ever allowed himself before, his gaze steady, searching in a way that was no longer guarded. And for a moment, it seemed as though he might speak, as though the words that had been held back would finally find form. But instead, he exhaled slowly, as though the act of speaking itself required something he had not yet decided to give. And when he did speak, his voice was lower than before, quieter, yet carrying a weight that settled deeply between them. "You have changed this place," he said, and the words were simple, yet they held more truth than he had intended to reveal, because he was not speaking of the conservatory alone, and Clara understood that, her gaze steady as it met his, her voice soft but certain. "It was never beyond change," she replied, and something in his expression shifted then, something that did not retreat, did not hide, because for the first time, he did not turn away from what stood before him, did not retreat into duty or distance, and the silence that followed stretched between them, not as a barrier, but as something that held them in place, because there was no longer anything left to ignore, and when his hand moved, it was slow, deliberate, not reaching for her, but resting lightly against the edge of the planter beside her, close enough that the space between them narrowed further, and though the gesture was small, restrained, it carried more weight than any declaration could have, because it was not avoidance, it was not distance, it was presence, and Clara felt it, not as certainty, not yet, but as something undeniable, something that had taken root without permission and grown beyond control. And as they stood there, in the quiet light of the conservatory, with winter pressing softly against the glass and something fragile yet unyielding growing between them, both of them understood, without needing to speak it aloud, that what had begun as obligation had become something far more dangerous, something neither of them had intended to feel, and something neither of them could walk away from now. The moment did not break, but it did not remain untouched either, because what had settled between them in the conservatory could not simply be folded back into silence, and Clara felt it in the hours that followed, in the way her thoughts refused to return to their former clarity, in the way every quiet step through Whitmore Hall now carried a weight that had not existed before, and she did not seek him, did not linger where he might appear, yet she became aware of him in ways she had not allowed herself to before, in the echo of his presence in the corridors, in the faint sound of his voice carried from distant rooms, and most of all in the absence of distance that had once defined everything between them. And for Alexander, the change was no less profound, though he did not name it, did not permit himself to examine it too closely, because to do so would mean confronting something he had long believed himself incapable of feeling again, and yet the memory of standing beside her, of choosing not to step away, lingered with a persistence he could not dismiss, and it unsettled him not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was not, and that familiarity carried a weight he had once sworn never to bear again. And so he kept his distance where he could, though it was no longer as absolute as before. And the following afternoon, when Clara was summoned to the main hall by the housekeeper, she did not expect what awaited her, because spread across the long table were invitations, formal and precise, their seals unbroken, their purpose unmistakable, and the housekeeper's voice was careful as she explained that the season's first gathering would soon take place, that the Duke would be expected to attend, and by extension, so would the Duchess, and Clara understood immediately what that meant, not a simple appearance, but a re-entry into the world that had already judged her without knowing her, a return to scrutiny that would not be as contained as Lady Evelyn's had been, and though her expression did not change, though her posture remained composed, something within her tightened, not fear, but awareness, because this would not be a quiet confrontation. This would be something far more public, far more difficult to endure with silence alone. And when Alexander entered the hall moments later, his gaze moved immediately to the invitations, then to Clara, and there was no surprise in his expression, because he had anticipated this, had prepared for it in ways she had not yet been allowed to consider. And for a brief moment, the silence between them returned, not as distance, but as something weighted, because this was no longer about what had begun quietly within the walls of Whitmore Hall. This was about what would be tested beyond them. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, yet carrying an undercurrent she had not heard before. "You are not obligated to attend," he said, the words measured, deliberate, as though offering her a choice he had not been certain he would give. And Clara's gaze held his, steady, unwavering, because she understood what refusal would mean, not freedom, but retreat, and she had not come this far to step back into invisibility, and her answer came without hesitation, though her voice remained soft. "I am your Duchess," she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any declaration could have, because it was not spoken from obligation alone. It was spoken from something steadier, something she had begun to claim as her own, and something in Alexander's expression shifted at that, something that did not resist, did not retreat, but acknowledged, and for the first time since that had been built not in a single moment, but in every silent step she had taken since arriving here. And below, Alexander waited, his presence composed as always, though there was something different in the way his gaze lifted when she descended, something that lingered longer than it should, something that did not retreat as quickly as before. And when she reached the final step, there was no formal greeting, no unnecessary words, only a quiet understanding that passed between them, because what awaited them beyond those doors would test more than appearances. It would test everything that had begun to change between them. And when he offered his arm, the gesture was simple, expected, yet unmistakable, and Clara accepted without hesitation, her hand resting lightly against his sleeve, the contact brief, yet grounding, and together they stepped into the night, into the waiting carriage, into the world that had already formed its opinions long before either of them had spoken a word. And the journey passed in near silence. But it was not the silence they had once shared. It was something steadier, something that did not push them apart, but held them in place, as though both understood that whatever distance had once defined them could no longer remain untouched. And when the carriage finally came to a halt, the grand estate before them illuminated in warm light, music faintly drifting into the cold air, Clara felt the weight of it settle fully, the reality of what lay ahead. And yet when Alexander stepped down and turned to offer his hand, his gaze meeting hers without hesitation, there was something in it that steadied her in return, something unspoken yet certain. And as they entered the ballroom, the shift was immediate. Conversations faltered, eyes turned, whispers rose and fell like distant waves, and Clara felt every glance, every unspoken question, every quiet judgment. But she did not falter. She did not retreat, because beside her, Alexander did not release her hand immediately, did not step away as he might have once done, and when he did, it was not to distance himself, but to stand beside her fully, his presence unmistakable, his attention unwavering, and the room adjusted around them. Not an acceptance, not yet, but an acknowledgement, because what stood before them was no longer a union defined by arrangement alone. And as the evening unfolded, as words were exchanged and formalities observed, Clara remained composed, steady, yet aware of every subtle shift, every moment where expectation met reality and faltered. And when the music began, when the first dance was called, there was a pause that stretched longer than it should have, a silence filled with anticipation, and then Alexander stepped forward, his hand extending toward her without hesitation, without doubt, and Clara placed her hand in his, her breath steady, her gaze unwavering, and as they moved across the floor, the world beyond them seemed to fade, not entirely, but enough, because in that moment, beneath the watchful eyes and whispered judgments, something undeniable had taken form, something neither of them had intended, something neither of them could now deny. And though no words were spoken, though no declaration was made, the truth settled quietly between them, steady as breath, certain as the rhythm guiding their steps, that what had begun in silence, in duty, in distance, had become something far more powerful, something that would not be undone by scrutiny or expectation. And as the music carried them forward, the future remained uncertain, the world beyond them still waiting to challenge what they had found, but for the first time, neither of them stood alone within it, and that was enough to change everything.